Hello, this is Dr. Laura Davis, and this is a short video on book 2 of Michael Ondaatje's book called In the Skin of a Lion. So just talking about what happens in book 2 and the progression of the plot, as well as the many revelations that come out during this book. I'm just going to start as book 2 starts with Patrick working as a dynamiter in the new waterworks under the lake. So we're introduced to the water works now. In the past, in the first book, we were introduced to the building of the bridge in Toronto, the Bloor Street Viaduct, and the history of the building of that bridge, which of course Ondaatje takes and fictionalizes. And through that, we're introduced to Nicholas Temelkoff. We're introduced to Patrick, Alice Gull, and Clara. And so in book 2, Patrick is working on this new project, which is the development of the waterworks in Toronto. So these are two major projects that are introduced in the book. So first the Bloor Street Viaduct, and the second one, the waterworks. So again, like he does with the Bloor Street Viaduct, Ondaatje builds upon real historical research with the building of the waterworks in Toronto, and talks about how there had to be tunnels built under one of the Great Lakes, one of the largest lakes in the world, in order to create the waterworks. And so Patrick, because of course we know his background, having watched his father work as a dynamiter, has this position where he can work as a dynamiter, building these tunnels under the lake to create the waterworks, which will supply water to the city of Toronto in the years to come. So we're introduced to that, and he's also a mucker. So he works as a mucker, but he also works as a dynamiter in this new tunnel of the waterworks. We find that he is invited to a labor activist meeting. He says, as he sees the invitation Sunday at 8 p.m., I believe it's given to him by a waitress in the place where he often has his breakfast. And so he gets this invitation and he goes to this meeting. Now, remember that at this time in Canada in the 20s and 30s, there were lots of labor movements. And so the book starts to move into this idea of the labor movement and of people who were doing hard labor, like we've seen with those who worked on the bridge, and like we're seeing now with those who worked on the waterworks. We're trying to get decent compensation for this stuff. So we really find the beginning of the unions in Canada in this time period in Toronto. So Ondaatje is also taking up that idea in this book. So when Patrick goes to this meeting at the waterworks, it's really interesting, and it sort of involves the theme of performance starts coming into play here, which we've seen and will continue to see all the way through the text. So they're on this illegal place, which is where the waterworks is being built, and Patrick sees that it's entertainment as well as a political meeting, and he sees this puppet show, which they're putting on as part of this labor activist union. He notices in this puppet show, which does play out the idea of a laborer trying to fight against the rich, the ones who are getting all the credit and taking these big projects on the backs of laborers. So this is what the puppet show is about. He notices gradually, and we see his gradual awareness through this scene, that the puppet is a human size. And so he starts to he gets mesmerized by this human puppet amongst the puppets in the puppet show, and he sort of goes closer and closer to the stage with the puppets and starts, as I said, getting mesmerized by the human puppet. He ends up going backstage, which is really interesting because there's a kind of break in the boundaries between the audience, Patrick and the audience, and then Patrick backstage amongst the actors and the puppets and all of the backstage stuff. And what we start to see is a kind of revelation. Okay, so there was a giant, but now his head comes off. He's no longer what he was. There's a dwarf that suddenly stands up and becomes human. So really interesting in terms of the that breaking of the boundaries between audience and what is seen, and also that challenging of that magic that happens during the performance. It's a magical, mesmerizing performance, and then suddenly that gets taken away, so that we see this kind of reality behind the appearance. So this idea of appearance and reality, performance or masks, and what's behind that comes into play here, and it also relates to the title of the book, In the Skin of a Lion, right? You're taking on the skin of somebody else. It's a mask that you're wearing. Eventually we find out that the human puppet is in fact Alice Gull, who Patrick has met through Clara in book 1. She was a good friend of Clara's. So just to go back to book 1 for a moment, to return to that moment when Patrick meets Alice, and at this point he is in love with Clara, but Clara takes off and goes back to Ambrose, of course. In book 1, Patrick meets Alice, and he spends some time with both Alice and Clara. And there's another kind of performance scene there. If you remember that Patrick is blindfolds himself and starts to perform, jump around the room and kind of perform his love for Clara blindfolded, saying he's going to show his tricks, that he can spin plates blindfolded and so on. So it's this performance, but then Clara moves and he ends up bumping into her and getting some blood. I think it's a bloody nose that he gets, and he says, you moved, right? You kind of upset the play of this. You didn't take on your normal role, and it mixed everything up. So we get that idea of performance there too. We also get, I think, the theme of blindness coming in. He's blindfolded at that point. The iguana is also blind. So that's another theme to pay attention to, what we have insight into and what we are blinded by, and how that plays out with the characters in The Skin of a Lion. A few pages before that, so that scene where Patrick is blindfolded and is kind of jumping around Clara is around page 79. And just before that, on page 75 and 76, we have Alice and Clara painting Patrick. So he's kind of on the floor sleeping, and they're kind of tracing him and creating some art with some crayons, almost like children. So this is kind of a moment where they're almost like childlike, and they're engaging in childhood play. It's also a kind of performance. It's a creation, and it's also a kind of marking of boundaries, right? Which is, I think we can see a kind of metafiction here too, because it's like drawing a person, drawing a character, right? Just like the author is drawing a character, there's a kind of demarcation there, even as there's play involved. And same with the scene with the puppets when Patrick goes back into the backstage. It's this idea of this novel is also a work of art, just like the play is. And there's all this behind the scenes stuff that's messier and real and so on, and that is behind the magic. So that kind of idea, performance, creativity, blindness, creation, is being played with here. Okay, I think I will stop the video there, and I will do a part 2 where I continue on discussing book 2. Thanks for listening.